knew that there was this unit at the Ministry of Defence that had been responsible for collecting these stories and investigating them, because I'd actually written to them. I'd sent some of the stories through and had a response, and it was like weird, you get this brown envelope on Her Majesty's service, from the UFO unit. I thought, well, there's all this stuff about Rendlesham Forest. We'd known about it since the News of the World broke the story in '83. There'd been all this speculation about what does the government know, why are they covering this up? And I thought, well, why has no one actually tried to make a request to see what they've got on file? So one of the first times I made a formal request under this pre-FOI legislation, which must have been about 2000, was for the Rendlesham Forest incident. And I just thought, well, I can make a good story out of this. But it was still quite a big breakthrough at the time. I just couldn't believe my eyes when this big thick envelope dropped through my letterbox one day, and I opened it up and this is the Rendlesham file that people have been looking for years. Key problem with the radar evidence is that the actual dates for the event that are recorded in Colonel Holt's memo, in the famous memo, were wrong. So because the MOD didn't take the opportunity to actually interview Colonel Holt and get him to itemise exactly what had happened and when it had happened, they were relying upon what he'd put in the memo. The 27th of December 1980 as the initial sighting, and the 29th of December as the second sighting. Now, we now know, in hindsight, that both of those dates were wrong. So when the Ministry of Defence circulated Colonel Holt's memo to the various air defence stations whose job it was to check if anything had been seen on radar, they were obviously working to two wrong dates. Eastern Radar was the other radar station, RAF Watton, who were involved, and they responded. The squadron leader Derek Coombe, who was in charge on that particular night, he does actually say in his response that on the night of the reported sighting, this is the night that Colonel Holt was out in the forest, and he actually patched through a call to Eastern Radar via the control tower at Bentwaters. And he says in this memo, and this is a contemporary document, 26th of February 1981, on the night of that reported sighting, our controller on duty was requested to view the radar. Nothing was observed, and the facts are recorded in our logbook of that night. So we can say for certain that on the night that Colonel Holt was out in the forest, in particular, that the RAF did actually check the radar picture at the time the events were unfolding, and that nothing was seen on radar. Now, we know in retrospect that there was two incidents, so there's nothing in these papers that can tell us, whether any checks were carried out on that initial evening. It does seem that, all down to the fact that they didn't follow up Holt's memo. If they'd have gone and actually done a proper investigation, they would have actually got to the facts in the first place. And they didn't even seem to be aware from this file that the local police, the Suffolk police, had gone out there, had been called out in the early hours of Boxing Day. There's a document that dates from about 1984, a policy document, which they used to brief Lord Hill Norton, who was a retired admiral who was absolutely obsessed by UFOs in retirement. And he was constantly asking questions in the House of Lords about Rendlesham. And they actually briefed him on the subject secretly at the MOD about 1984. And that, to me, is the most significant document, because they effectively say the reason we didn't take it seriously is because Colonel Holt didn't take it seriously. Yep. If Colonel Holt and his men, when they were seeing these strange lights in the sky, had taken it seriously, they wouldn't have just spent all night wandering around in the fields and then effectively gone back to bed. They would have pressed the panic button, they would have scrambled the RAF, there would have been escalation of action. And the Ministry of Defence's attitude that you can piece together from all these bits of paper was that he didn't do that. He didn't escalate. He kept it really low key. He waited for the British base commander to come back from Christmas holiday. 2 weeks later, sort of walked into his office and said, "Oh, by the way, Don, the aliens landed over Christmas, but I didn't want to disturb your holiday." So anonymous letter, postmarked 30th of March 2015, which arrived on the 1st of April. Draw your own conclusions. But anyway, quite an elaborate 2-page letter. And in one occasion, this must have been in the summer of 1980, we were airlifted in middle of the night, dropped onto the perimeter of the base, and our mission was to penetrate the American defences, get into the base without them seeing us, to see how good they were at defending. Unfortunately, they were very good at defending the perimeter, and they were all captured. treated them really, really offhandedly and basically referred to them as enemy aliens. And he says that this word aliens stuck in their minds. So after this ordeal and they got back to their base, they thought, right, we'll show these Americans a thing or two, and we'll show them some real aliens. So what they decided to do was go back a few nights later, penetrate the defences again, and they took all these sort of flashbangs and pyrotechnics, and they sent up balloons with lights attached and everything, and showed them a real alien invasion. So this letter was basically saying, this is what caused the UFO incidents. We, the SAS, were playing a hoax on the Americans to get our own back for what they did to us. I have been able to ascertain that there was some kind of incident where the SAS did get into some kind of confrontation with the Americans when they were actually testing the defences of the base, I think about August 1980. So that incident did actually happen, and Georgina Bruni actually mentions it in passing in her book. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if somebody who's very familiar with the story had read that in Georgina Bruni's book and then concocted this elaborate tale and sent it to me based upon that, thinking that if I checked it out, I'd find the reference in Georgina Bruni's book and think, oh, that corroborates what this guy's saying. The actual base commander is a guy called Ted Conrad, who was from Texas, and he was there throughout the incident, and he was the person who was actually in charge during this whole period. And if there was any sort of investigation or inquiry, he would have been the one who launched it. In fact, he was the one who actually sent Colonel Holt out into the forest with the other security police. He basically said that whilst Holt was out in the forest, that basically there had been an investigation, that he'd ordered it, an informal one, but he'd not escalated it. Penniston had told him that he'd never actually got close enough to this thing to see what it was, but it looked mechanical and it looked like the shape of a Jeep. Now, if you read Jim Penniston's story now, he actually went up to it, touched it, he had this downloaded binary code into his head and all this kind of thing that's all come out subsequently. But Conrad was saying, this just sounds like science fiction to me. You know, at the time, no one came out with any of this. You know, we just had this basic thing about lights being seen in the forest. Conrad and all these other special constables and what have you were out looking in the same direction that Holt were looking, couldn't see a thing in the sky. They were talking to each other on radio. They were speaking to the control tower. They were asking the radar operator to see, can you see anything where Holt's looking? Nothing. And yet Holt can see these things moving around, shooting beams to the ground, etc., etc. How do you explain that? Now, it may have been a lighthouse. It may have been some other natural phenomena, but that's beside the point. There's two things involved. There's the few certain facts that you can ascertain from the original documents and from their statements that they made at the time, and there's the legend, which it's become, because the more they tell it, the more it becomes elaborated, and that creates the legend. Unfortunately, we reach this impasse, but there are people who sort of can only see it in black and white. It's either aliens or people from the future came here and landed in Rendlesham Forest, or it's the sceptical version, which is people were all lying or they'd been misled by ordinary things. It's either one or the other. And I don't see it like that at all. I see it as the thing is a legend, which is all those constituent parts of it play a part in creating the legend. When we actually look at what's the evidence for King Arthur, there isn't any. There's a piece of rock with Arthur scratched in it that somebody found buried in Cornwall. There's a couple of books that have survived in the Welsh annals that mention a warrior called Arthur who fought against the Saxons. Books that were written 200 years after the event. That's the evidence for King Arthur. I've absolutely no doubt people will be talking about Rendlesham Forest incident in the same way that there was this mystical happening in the forest. And I don't think it'll ever be resolved because there is no way to resolve it. And that's the definition of a legend. We can't go back and go back in a time machine. I wish we could and reconstruct what actually happened. That people like they want an explanation for it, but they want it to be a sort of a, gee whiz, is that the real explanation? How surprising. And they're not prepared to accept it's just ordinary things that people see in extraordinary circumstances.